Thank you for joining me for Part 2 Stardust. If you haven't seen Part 1 and would like to, which is the true crime story of Ed Gein, click the link in the top right-hand corner or the link down in the description. Now, let's get into the movies and characters that were inspired by the Plainfield Ghoul. This isn't a complete list, but it includes some of the most well-known movies and books. Even though we haven't gotten a retelling of Ed Gein's story that is 100% accurate, the movies have been entertaining and disturbing. The first film to put Ed on the silver screen, and probably the most well-known, is Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece Psycho from 1960. This movie was an adaptation of Robert Bloch's novel of the same name that was released in 1959. The character, Norman Bates, played by the legendary Anthony Perkins, is introduced to the audience with him wearing his woman suit when Marion Crane pulls up looking for a room to stay in. But this is something you realize at the end of the film. Like Ed Gein, Norman was obsessed with his mother. He couldn't part with her or her body, and so he became her. Norman was also sexually frustrated and inexperienced, which fueled his sexual, violent outbursts. As a mama's boy, he had no friends, never had a girlfriend, and his mother likely spoke negatively about sex and women, just as Augusta did. In the 10 years since his mother passed, Norman killed 4 people, 3 of whom were women who he spied on through his secret people, including Marion. Norman also had a slim physique and a bit of a speech impediment, although much less severe than Ed's. Norman's fascination with taxidermy is a nod to Ed's pastime of using human skin to upholster his furniture. And of course, Ed and his mother didn't run a hotel on their farm, which was used in Robert's story as the setting for Norman's unforgettable acts of violence. Another major difference is Ed's choice of weapon seemed to be a rifle, not a knife like the one used in Psycho. All in all, Norman Bates was the version of Ed that was in some ways a little creepier, but in most ways didn't even come close to depicting the heinous acts committed by Ed. The television series Bates Motel aired from 2013 to 2017 and was labeled a contemporary prequel to Psycho. It was near perfect. The next title on the list is Canadian film Deranged, Confessions of a Necrophile, from 1974, directed by Jeff Gillen and Alan Ormsby. Alan also wrote the screenplay. This fun psychological horror film is a wonderful mix between quirky, gross, and just plain weird. It stars Robert Blossom as Ezra Cobb, another version of Ed Gein. Robert Blossom is most well known for his role as Marley in Home Alone. Set on a farm in the rural Midwest, the story begins with Ez's abusive, bedridden mother dying a bloody, disgusting death as he attempts to feed her. In that first year after her death, Ez begins to spiral and lets the house become trashed, and begins to hear voices that convince him to dig up his mother's body from her grave. At home, he talks to her corpse and brings her the skin of other corpses to repair her decaying face. He also has a skin suit for himself. Like Ed, Ez is sexually repressed and frustrated. He doesn't have a good relationship with sex because his mother brainwashed him, turning him into a misogynist. When he's aroused, he hears his mother's disapproving comments and becomes violent. This is all pretty similar to Ed's actual life, but this movie definitely takes some creative liberties. For instance, there's a seance with Ez and his mother's friend, a psychic. Ezra has friends, and he seeks companionship with a young woman, Mary, who he eventually murders. Strangely, Ez sets up a dinner for Mary and his mother, along with the other corpses he's collected. And it's very similar to the dinner in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was released 6 months after Deranged. At the end of the film, we see Sally Mae's corpse hanging, much like the way Bernice's body was hanging in Ed's summer kitchen. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was also released in 1974. It was written by Tobe Hooper and Kim Hinkle, with Tobe Hooper directing. Even though TCM and Deranged share the dinner table scene, TCM is a completely different movie with a completely different type of serial killer. In this movie, Ed Gein inspired the character Leatherface, who wears a mask made of human skin and kills anyone who comes near his home, which is trashed with garbage, blood, bones, and who knows what else. Placing his live victims on meat hooks is a sure nod to finding Bernice's body. But Leatherface doesn't live alone. He lives with his equally psychotic and murderous family. Next, we have comedy horror Motel Hell from 1980, starring the prolific Rory Calhoun and Nancy Parsons, and was directed by Kevin Connor. In this satirical thriller, we have a brother and sister, Vincent and Ida, who run Hotel Hello and are famous for their delicious smoked sausages. Their secret ingredient is human flesh. So they kidnap people and plant them in their secret garden until they're ready for harvesting. To keep them from crying out for help, their vocal cords are taken out. After Vincent hunts down a couple and plants the boyfriend in their garden, he decides to keep the girl, Terry, around for some fun. Vincent's younger brother, Bruce, the town's sheriff, at first gives Vincent the benefit of the doubt, but soon finds himself having to rescue Terry from Vincent before making her a new addition to the secret garden. By the end, we see a chainsaw battle between the two brothers, with Vince wearing a pig's head for a mask, imagery we recognize from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, along with the gutted corpses hanging from meat hooks. This sci-fi story doesn't resemble that of Ed Gein and his family, but the essence of Gein's insanity is present. Vincent and Ida saw human beings as nothing more than worthless animals who were at their disposal. Ed, Vince, and Ida share a lack of empathy for others, which makes them dangerous. This movie is a cross between Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and American Gothic. Silence of the Lambs is next on the list. Novelist Thomas Harris birthed his character Buffalo Bill in 1988 with the release of his novel, which was adapted into a film of the same name that was released in 1991. Played by Ted Levine, Buffalo Bill is not only inspired by Ed Gein, but instead, he is based off of a total of 6 different serial killers. Directed by Jonathan Demme, and starring Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster, this movie delivers to us everything we fear about serial killers to the screen. Buffalo Bill described himself as a transsexual and murdered overweight women in order to skin them to make himself a woman suit, because he believed that by creating the suit, he could become the woman he believes he should be. Sound familiar? The other serial killers Thomas Harris based his character on were Jerry Brudos, who strangled his victims, dressed up in their clothes and kept their shoes; Edmund Kemper, who also killed his grandparents to, quote, just see what it felt like; Gary M. Heidnik, who held his victims prisoner in a pit; Gary Ridgway, who dumped women's bodies in rivers and put objects in their corpses; and finally Ted Bundy, who would pretend to be injured and asked for help in order to catch his victims off guard. Up next is another comedy horror film starring the fabulous Steve Buscemi, who plays Ed in Ed and His Dead Mother, which was released in 1993 and directed by Jonathan Wax. Despite the title of the movie, this is far from a retelling of Ed and his mother's life. Ed is actually a likable guy in the movie, but he hasn't gotten over his abusive mother's death a year later. He lives with his maternal uncle who is happy about his annoying sister not being around anymore. Things take a sci-fi turn when a salesman, who is after Ed's insurance money, approaches Ed, offering to bring his mother back to life for just $1,000. Ed is hesitant at first, but accepts the offer. However, over time, he feels that something isn't quite right when his mom, Mabel, becomes violent and erratic. He actually turns against his mother after he begins to fall for his sexy neighbor and decapitates her before putting her back in her grave. Now, Ed Gein would have never turned against his mother, and he also wouldn't have had a sexual relationship with a woman, a live woman at that, while Augusta was around. What's funny is Ed actually owns and works at a hardware store, like Ed Gein's victim, Bernice Worden. and his ex-employee is a character who more resembles Ed Gein's nature, creepy and up to no good. The movie starts out with trying to trick the audience into thinking we were going to get a sort of retelling of Gein's story, by starting off in court with Ed having to explain that he decapitated his mother's head only after she died, instead of actually killing her himself. This movie feels like a lighthearted reanimator. Steve Buscemi played another version of Ed just 4 years later in Simon West's Con Air, which was released in 1997. Steve's character was Garland Green, the Marietta Mangler. Writer Scott Rosenberg used 5 different serial killers as inspiration, and of course, Ed Gein was one of them. Garland Green also loved butchering his corpses, keeping the decapitated heads, and dismembering body parts. He also wears clothing and apparel made from human skin. Like Ted Bundy, he had homicidal tendencies and drove through states to avoid authorities. He had cult-like instincts like Charles Manson, had a calm demeanor and was insane like Jeffrey Dahmer, and like John Wayne Gacy, he had no problems with killing children. The next film is from 2000, and is the most accurate depiction of Ed Gein's life on the farm, although it does still take a lot of creative liberties. Written by Stephen Johnston and directed by Chuck Perrello, it stars Steve Railsback as Ed and Carrie Snodgrass as Augusta. Even though Ed Gein, In the Light of the Moon, won Best Film and Best Actor at Sitges in 2000, it isn't a memorable movie. While we witness Ed commit his heinous crimes, there's a lack of grit and style that make the movie-watching experience somehow boring. This movie is also very difficult to find, which is interesting, since it is the most accurate account of events. The filmmakers did a great job with depicting his controlling, fundamentalist mother, who Ed loved and respected no matter how terrible she was to him. Ed was shown as the guy everyone dismissed and treated like a grown child, although there were people who had their suspicions about him. The casting for Ed was spot on this one. House of a Thousand Corpses is another movie that doesn't attempt to retell Ed's story, but rather it creates an atmosphere and incorporates elements of horror and actual true crime events. While it draws inspiration from various slasher movies and real-life grotesque tales, Ed Gein's influence is easy to spot. Otis wears a mask made of human skin, the Firefly family enjoys dismembering bodies, and their disgusting home is littered with body parts and blood. Ed Gein, The Butcher of Plainfield, was released in 2007 and was written and directed by Michael Pfeiffer. Michael wrote the film in 3 days and shot it in 10, and honestly, it shows. This movie might have been more successful had it been given a different title, and didn't portray itself as the actual accounts of Ed Gein. Kane Hodder, aka Jason, is cast as Ed Gein, which right away seems like a mistake, because Kane is big and hulking, the opposite of what the meek Ed Gein was. In this movie, Ed's murders aren't done with a rifle. His victims were young women and men who crossed him. He hangs live women to the meat hooks. He killed with his bare hands in front of people. He kidnaps a sheriff's girlfriend who escapes, and just a number of other things that have nothing to do with Ed Gein's story. It's frustrating that this filmmaker decided to use actual photos from Ed's farm and true facts in the beginning and end credits because he's trying to present this as the real-life events when it's far from the truth. It's also a complete waste of the use of actor Michael Berryman. The last movie I just had to include was Terrifier from 2016. Although Damien Leone certainly draws inspiration from many sources for his character, Art the Clown, Ed Gein's influence is also recognizable in this one. In the second act, Art hangs a woman by her feet before sawing her body down the middle. Not quite a gutting, but most definitely an act influenced by Ed. Art also wears the torso of one of his female victims and prances around in an effeminate way, a much different demeanor than when he's wearing his clown suit. Ed Gein has become a lasting figure in the realm of horror and true crime storytelling, and will forever be referenced whether intentional or not. Because of the disturbing nature of Ed Gein's crimes, people wonder if Ed was born a killer or if he was molded into one. But the answer is quite clear. Ed had a tragic upbringing with an abusive and manipulative mother who was also abused as a child. Her religious values led her to fear the world around her, in turn, halting the healthy development of her children. Augusta's fearmongering had a much bigger effect on Ed than it did on his brother Henry, which caused him to become sexually repressed, emotionally stunted, and socially unintelligent. This mixture is a recipe for a horror story, which is exactly what we got in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Thank you again for joining me today, fellow Stardust. I hope I see you in the next one. Peace.